The smoke came before the fire, and Mira had learned long ago that the first thing to burn in Stonewolf Dominion was always the thing you loved most. She was pressed against the cold stone of the eastern granary wall when she felt it, the first pulse low in her belly, deep and insistent, like a second heartbeat answering a call she had not made. 9 months. 9 months she had carried the weight of what no Omega was supposed to survive, what no pack law permitted her to name. And now the Ashvale Pack's birthing hall was lit from within by something that had nothing to do with candles. The orange glow at the horizon told her everything. Someone had set the fires deliberately. Someone who knew exactly where the Omega Quarter lay, and exactly whose children waited there to be born. She pressed one hand flat against the stone and breathed through her nose. Cold, ash, and beneath both of those, something else. Something that did not belong to the Ashvale fires, or the Ashvale wind. Something that smelled of pine, resin, and iron and a winter she had never lived through, from a territory she had never been allowed to enter. She pressed harder against the wall and tried not to make a sound. The Ironvale King was here, in Ashvale territory. And Mira, last and lowest of all the unclaimed Omegas, carrying 9 lives she had no right to and no name to shelter them under, was the only one who had noticed. She had been hidden in corners her entire life. She had learned to be small. But tonight, smallness was not going to be enough. The fire reached the granary wall 3 minutes later, and Mira ran. She did not run toward the gates, where every other pack member with any standing would be fleeing, taking their children and their mates and their documented bonds sealed in the Alpha's registry. She ran because the pull in her belly told her to, because the low ache that had been building since before dawn was not fear. Exactly, though fear was threaded all through it. She ran because the 9 small lives inside her had, in the strange way of things that are almost born, already decided. They were pulling toward the pine and iron scent the way water pulls toward low ground. Inevitable, without her permission. That was the thing about an Omega who had been unmated and unnamed for 26 years, in a pack that barely registered her existence. She had grown very skilled at recognizing the moments when her own body made choices without consulting her. The mate bond did not ask. The pull did not knock before it entered. And the 9 lives inside her, who shared whatever echo of that pull she carried within her blood, were not waiting for her to think it through. She ran through the east corridor, past the collapsed door of the Omega dormitory, past the overturned water barrels and the scattered pallet beds where 12 other women had slept last night and were now, please the old gods, already gone. The smoke was heavier here. She pulled the front of her rough-woven shift up over her nose and kept moving, one hand curved under the enormous, taut weight of her belly, the other trailing the wall for guidance because her eyes were streaming and the corridor had gone orange and gray in alternating pulses. She had counted the lives inside her 47 times. She had pressed her palms flat against her skin in the dark dormitory nights and felt each one shift and settle, each one a distinct, separate warmth. 47 counts, 9 lives, 9 separate heartbeats. The healers who had reluctantly attended her, because pack law said even unclaimed Omegas were owed basic care, even if the lip curl of the senior healer told her exactly how the woman felt about fulfilling that obligation, the healers had called it unprecedented. They had said it in the tone of voice that meant monstrous. 9 pups was not a litter. 9 pups was something out of the old texts, the founding stories, the parts of pack history that polite wolves did not discuss at meals. She had not been polite a day in her life, by virtue of having no standing from which to perform politeness, so she had listened to the old texts instead. The east granary wall cracked above her. She moved faster. She could not say afterward exactly when she left the Ashvale boundary and entered the no man's land beyond it, the scorched strip of open ground that separated Ashvale territory from the Ironvale border. She had not been tracking the exact moment. She had been tracking the ground under her feet and the pain that was now coming in long, rolling waves from low in her body, the kind of pain that meant something was happening that could not be postponed. The 9 lives had chosen their moment with the same lack of consultation they had shown throughout. Tonight, now, here, on scorched ground, between two enemy packs. With the fire still visible at her back and the pine forest of Ironvale Dominion visible ahead as a dark, impossible wall of shadow and cold, she stopped walking. She could not help it. The pain crested, and she went to her knees on the ash-gray ground, one hand still pressed to the outside of her belly, and she breathed 4 counts in, 4 counts out the way the reluctant healer had taught her, while looking pointedly at the wall above Mira's head. That was where the Ironvale King found her. She heard him before she saw him. Heard, first, the sound of large feet moving over scorched ground with the practiced silence of someone who had spent decades learning to move without announcing himself and failing, slightly, because the ground here was uneven and brittle with heat, and even wolves of considerable skill left traces. Then she heard voices, low and clipped, in the direction of the tree line. Not the ragged, desperate voices of Ashvale refugees. Organized voices, command voices. She looked up. He was standing 8 feet away, and the fire behind her was painting him in amber and shadow, and she understood immediately why no one in any of the territories spoke about the Ironvale King in mild terms. He was large in the way that command makes men large, not merely the physical breadth of him, which was considerable, but the way space seemed to reconfigure around him, to acknowledge him without his asking. Dark hair, a jaw like something quarried from the same material as his territory's mountains. A long traveling coat, unbuttoned, that moved with the wind and was. She noticed with the strange clarity that pain sometimes brings, already streaked with ash. He had been here for a while. He had been close enough to be touched by the Ashvale fire. His eyes found her immediately. That was the thing she registered second, how fast his eyes found her, as though she were not kneeling in gray ash in the near dark between 2 fires. As though she were lit from within by something that had nothing to do with the burning granary behind her. His name was Calder, King Calder of Ironvale. She knew him from reports and rumor and the low, careful whispers of the senior pack women who discussed him the way you discuss a storm system moving toward your coast with respect, with fear, and with the helpless, guilty note of something that might be longing. He was looking at her the way no one had ever looked at Mira in her life. Not at her condition, not at the enormous evidence of her pregnancy, the round, taut weight of her that would have made any Ashvale pack member's eyes go first to the absence of a mating mark on her throat, then to the count of her months, then to the arithmetic of scandal. Calder was not doing that arithmetic. He was looking at her face. Specifically, he was looking at her eyes, and his expression had shifted into something she could not name, because she had no reference for it, a kind of arrested stillness, as though he had been moving very fast, and something had suddenly stopped him. She did not have time to think about what that meant, because another wave of pain arrived and she pressed her free hand to the ground for balance and breathed through it, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on a point 6 inches in front of her knees. She heard him move. Faster than a man that size had any right to move. Then he was crouching in front of her, one large hand hovering 2 inches from her shoulder, not touching, not yet. "How long?" he said. It was not entirely a question. "Since before the fire started," she said. "Because this was not a moment for anything other than truth. I think they're coming." A pause. She could feel, without looking, the way his attention moved over her, not with the assessing coldness of the Ashvale pack hierarchy reading her for status and marks and worth, but with something more urgent and more careful, a kind of reading that was trying to understand, rather than classify. "You were in Ashvale, also not a question." "Omega Dormitory, East Quarter," she breathed. It was deliberate. Someone knew where the Omegas slept. She felt the shift in his stillness. Whatever he had been holding carefully contained moved, slightly. His jaw tightened. She could see that much from her peripheral vision, which was all she had, because she could not quite look at him directly and manage anything else at the same time. "Can you walk?" he said. "I could walk until about a minute ago," she said honestly. "I am reassessing." Something moved across his face that might, in other circumstances, have been the beginning of something warmer. He did not let it finish. He stood, turned slightly, and said something in a low, rapid clip to the nearest of his people, 3 figures at the tree line. She could see them now, all carrying Iron Veil colors, all watching with the professional blankness of people trained to witness their king doing something unprecedented without registering it as such. Then he turned back to her and said, quietly, as though it were simply the next logical step in a sequence, "I'm going to carry you." She looked up at him for the first time directly. It was a mistake, perhaps, because looking at him directly was not like looking at anything else she had looked at in her 26 years. The amber light was doing something to the darkness of his eyes that she was not prepared for. They were gray, she realized, not the pale, washed-out gray of someone who had lost something. A deep, specific gray, like the moment in winter just before the sky commits to snow, certain, weighted. The bond in her blood, the echo of it, the pull without a name moved. She had carried it for 9 months. She had felt it from the moment the 9 lives had begun to make themselves known inside her, that inexplicable pull toward a scent she had never encountered, toward a territory she had never entered, toward something the old texts called the completion of a fated line. She had told herself it was the pups. She had told herself it was the pregnancy making her body strange and susceptible. She had told herself anything that was not the truth, because the truth was that Mira, unmated omega of Ashvale, lowest in every hierarchy that had ever bothered to include her, had felt, for 9 months, the phantom certainty of a bond she had no right to. The bond recognized him immediately. It did not ask her permission. It did not give her time to argue. She breathed through another wave of pain and said, "All right." He lifted her as though the weight of her 9 pups, 9 months, all of it were simply a thing he had been built to carry, and it startled her more than anything else had tonight. That complete and immediate steadiness, no adjustment, no grunt of effort. He gathered her against his chest, the way you gather something that belongs to you, with the particular efficiency of someone who is not performing the gesture but executing it, and she felt, against every surviving rational instinct she possessed, the tight coil of alarm inside her chest begin to loosen. She pressed her face against his collarbone and breathed pine resin, iron, cold winter that she recognized. That she had been recognizing for 9 months without having ever smelled it until this moment, and the bond sang in her blood like a wire pulled suddenly taut. The fire was still visible behind them when they crossed the Iron Veil tree line. She could feel the change in air temperature, the smoke and heat of Ashvale giving way to the deep, cold, resinous cold of Iron Veil pine forest. The ground changed under his feet, from scorched flatland to the soft, needle-thick floor of old growth. The sounds changed, too. The distant crack and roar of the fire fell away and was replaced by wind through branches and the low, professional sounds of Iron Veil wolves, organizing themselves with the efficiency of a pack that had not forgotten what it was trained for. She heard his heartbeat under her ear. It was very steady, steadier than hers, which had reason to be less so. She focused on it the way she had learned to focus, on the 47 counts of 9 heartbeats inside her as a kind of anchor, a fixed point around which the rest of the world could spin without taking her with it. The pain was coming faster now. She understood what that meant. She had spent 9 months understanding what things meant because no one was going to explain them to her. The reluctant healer had covered the mechanics with the clipped efficiency of someone discharging a legal minimum, and the other Omega women, kinder but frightened of association with anything as unprecedented as a 9-pup pregnancy in an unmated Omega, had offered sympathy in small, furtive installments. She had read the rest herself from the pack library, in the early morning hours when the library was empty of anyone who might object to her presence there. She knew what the accelerating rhythm meant. She knew it was not going to wait. "I need to stop," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. He was already slowing. She could feel the shift in how he was holding her, the adjustment that said he had been tracking the changes in her breathing with the same attention she had been giving to his heartbeat. "There is a station," he said, quietly. 40 seconds. He was not asking if she could wait 40 seconds. He was telling her. The distinction felt important. She breathed. She counted. The 40 seconds came and went, and then there was a structure around her, not a building exactly, more a deep lean-to shelter of the kind that border patrols used. backed against an enormous pine, and open on one side to the forest. Clean straw had been laid on the raised platform floor at some point, still relatively fresh. She registered all of this in fragments because the pain had her full attention now, and she was past the point of managing anything elegantly. He set her down on the platform with the same steadiness with which he had lifted her, and then he was at the open side of the shelter, speaking rapidly and quietly to one of the figures who had followed them from the border. And she heard a name, Senna, and the figure moved immediately, moving fast into the trees, and she understood that Senna was a healer and that Senna was being sent for, and she was absurdly, disproportionately grateful. She was also, she realized, looking at him. She could not seem to stop. He had his back partially to her, and she could see the set of his shoulders, the tension in them, the quality of it, which was not the tension of someone performing leadership, but of someone who was genuinely, personally concerned. His coat had ash on the left shoulder and a long scorch mark along the back hem that told her he had been in the fire, not at the edges of it, in it. He had been in the Asheville fire. She was going to think about that later when she had capacity for sustained thought. Right now, she had other things to think about. She pressed both palms flat against her belly and felt, beneath the pain, the 9 separate warmths shifting and settling and preparing, the way she had felt them shift and settle every night for 9 months. Moving now with purpose, with readiness. "They're almost here," she said. She was not sure she meant him to hear it. It was more in the nature of a declaration to the 9 lives themselves, an acknowledgement. She had carried them through everything the last 9 months had produced. She had carried them through the dismissal and the whispers and the pointed arithmetic of the pack hierarchy. She had carried them through the fire. She heard him turn. He came to the edge of the platform and crouched there, at the same careful distance as before present, but not crowding her, letting her have the space she needed while remaining, unambiguously, within reach. It was the most sophisticated understanding of what she needed that anyone had demonstrated in a very long time, and she suspected he was not fully aware he was doing it. It seemed instinctive. It seemed like him. "The healer will be here in minutes," he said. "They may not wait minutes," she said. "Then we don't wait for the healer," he said, with absolute steadiness, and she understood that he was telling her he was not leaving. That whatever happened in the next minutes or hours or however long this took, he was not stepping back from the edge of this platform and waiting at a professional distance. He had carried her out of the fire. He was staying. She did not know what to do with that. She had spent 26 years knowing, with complete and reliable clarity, exactly where she stood in every space she occupied. At the bottom, against the wall. In the corner. She had learned to be useful from that position, to make herself small enough that no one had reason to remove her from even that minimal foothold. She had learned not to want what she was not going to be given. The bond in her blood was not interested in any of that learning. It was pulling toward him with the quiet, relentless gravity of something geological, slow and enormous and not subject to argument. She breathed through the next wave, and when it passed, she said, because she needed to say something real and she no longer had the energy for anything else, "My name is Mira. I don't have a pack name. I don't have a mating mark. The pups don't have a registered sire. By Asheville law, by most pack law, they don't." She stopped, breathed. Continued. "They don't have standing. They shouldn't be here. By every law that anyone has bothered to write down, none of this should be happening." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, with the same quality of absolute steadiness that was, she was beginning to understand, simply how he operated. "You're in Iron Vale now." She waited for him to finish the sentence. He let the silence hold instead, and she realized, slowly, that he had already finished it. That in Iron Vale now was the complete statement. That the rest of the sentence, what Asheville law had decided about Mira and her children, was simply not relevant to the Iron Vale frame he was offering. The bond moved again, pulled again. She pressed her palms harder against her belly and breathed and did not let herself cry, though the pressure behind her eyes had been building for a while now. The compound pressure of a night that had given her everything she had feared and something she had no name for yet. The healer arrived Senna, brisk and competent, and blessedly unsentimental. A woman of 50-odd years with the efficient hands of someone who had seen many things and classified none of them as impossible. She moved past Calder with a nod that was also, somehow, a greeting between people who had worked together long enough to have abbreviated that into a single gesture. And she settled beside Mira on the platform and began assessing with her hands with the same quick competence. And Mira felt something she had spent 9 months not feeling, adequately cared for. She reached out, without thinking, and her hand found the edge of Calder's coat. Not his hand, just the fabric, the hem of it, where he was still crouched at the edge of the platform. She was not sure why she did it. She was not sure she could have done otherwise. The bond was making decisions again. He did not move away. He settled slightly, a barely perceptible shift in his weight that brought him one fraction closer without crowding her, and he stayed. The Ironvale forest was cold and dark around the shelter, and the fire was invisible now behind the trees. And Senna was saying something calm and instructive. And the 9 lives inside Mira were moving with the urgency of the imminent. And the bond between her blood and the man crouching at the edge of the platform hummed with a certainty she had been carrying for 9 months without being able to name. She held the fabric of his coat and breathed. The first pup arrived with the pre-dawn gray. Senna announced it with the calm satisfaction of a craftsperson who has done difficult work well. Mira felt the particular release of it, the first of 9, the first pressure eased, the first separate heartbeat that was now outside rather than inside. She heard the sound of it, the first indignant declaration of a new life meeting cold air, and something cracked open in her chest that she had not known was sealed shut. She had been afraid to hope for them. She had understood, somewhere in the animal core of herself, that hoping for them was too dangerous, that to love something that the world had already decided had no standing was to court a grief so profound it might not be survivable. She had counted them 47 times and given them the love of her palms against her belly in the dark, but she had kept it careful. She had kept it small. The first pup was placed in her arms, and she understood immediately that she had been fooling herself for 9 months. There was nothing small about this. She had never been capable of anything small where these 9 lives were concerned. She looked at the tiny face, dark hair, already. The impossible dark of someone who had opinions about their own appearance even at the moment of arrival, and the grief she had been afraid to court was replaced by something with far more structural integrity. Something load-bearing. She became aware that Calder had made a sound. She looked up. He was watching her with the expression she had tried to name before and failed that arrested stillness, and she understood now that it was not a king's expression. It was not the expression of power or authority or strategic appraisal. It was the expression of someone who has seen something that has reorganized his understanding of a situation he thought he had already assessed. She held the first pup and met his eyes, and the bond between them stopped being a pull and became something with weight and presence, something that occupied space in the world rather than simply her blood. The next 4 hours were the most difficult and the most remarkable of Mira's life, which was already a life that had accumulated a significant collection of difficult and remarkable. Senna was patient and skilled, and occasionally terse in the way that competent people under sustained pressure sometimes are. Calder did not leave. She had not really thought he would, not after the first 10 minutes, but some part of her had expected the king's pragmatism to reassert itself at some point, the calculation that he had done the necessary work, had carried the woman from the fire, had provided shelter and a healer, and that his presence at the rest of it was above and beyond whatever obligation had brought him to the Ashvale border tonight. He stayed. He stayed through all 9. He stayed through the first and the second and the drawn-out difficult third and the fourth and fifth who arrived with dramatic urgency, one immediately after the other, as though they had been arguing about the order for months and had finally settled it. He stayed through the 6th and 7th, which came in the deepest cold of pre-dawn when even the Ironvale pines seemed to have drawn inward against the temperature. He stayed through the 8th, who was quieter than the others and made Senna's face go careful for a moment, before the healer did something Mira could not see, and the pup declared itself with a delayed, fierce indignation that made Mira's heart restart. He stayed through the 9th the last, the one who had apparently decided that 9 months of gestation plus this entire extraordinary night had not been quite sufficient, and who required an additional 30 minutes of negotiation before arriving with a composure that suggested they were doing everyone a favor. 9. All 9. Senna laid the last one in Mira's arms alongside its siblings, arranged with the practical efficiency of a woman who had improvised many times and saw no reason to be sentimental about the process. And then Senna sat back on her heels and looked at Mira with an expression that was the first genuinely unguarded thing Mira had seen on an adult face in 9 months. 9 pups, Senna said, not in the tone of the Ashvale healer, who had made the word 9 sound like an accusation. In the tone of someone saying, I have seen many things, and this is extraordinary, and I am not ashamed to say so. 9, Mira confirmed. Her voice was not entirely steady. She was not going to apologize for that. She looked up at Calder. He was standing now, had been standing for a while, though she could not have said exactly when he had moved from crouching to standing. He was looking at all of them at her, at the 9 small lives arranged in her arms, and in the makeshift warmth that Senna had constructed, and his face was the most open she had seen it. The careful, weighted control that she had read as characteristic was still there, but it had shifted, like stone shifting, to reveal the water that had been running beneath it all along. She understood, looking at him in that moment, that he had come to the Ashvale border tonight knowing there was fire, not fleeing fire, moving toward it. She had understood this in theory since she saw the ash on his coat, but she understood it now in the fuller sense. He had gone toward the fire. She thought about all the things she did not know yet, why he had been at the Ashvale border tonight, whether he had known about her, specifically whether someone in the complicated machinery of pack politics had told him about the unmated Omega carrying an unprecedented litter and what that might mean in terms of the old texts, the founding stories, the parts of pack history that polite wolves did not discuss, whether the bond she had been carrying for 9 months was something he had been carrying too, from whatever distance, in whatever form. She did not ask those things yet. She was not capable, at this exact moment, of the conversation those questions required. But she held them, the way she had held the 9 lives, carefully, with full attention, with the understanding that they were hers to tend. He moved closer and crouched again at the edge of the platform, and he said quietly, "Are you all right?" She took stock. She was exhausted in a way that went past the ordinary vocabulary of exhaustion into something almost geological. She was warm despite the cold because Senna had covered her efficiently, and the 9 pups were generating their own formidable amount of heat. She was in Ironvale territory with no possessions, no pack affiliation, no mating mark, no documented anything, surrounded by people who served a king she had met 2 hours ago. She was, she realized, more all right than she had been at any point in the last 9 months, possibly longer. "Yes?" she said. He nodded. Then he said, still quietly, still with that quality of steadiness that was simply him, "The fire at Ashvale was set by order of the Ashvale Alpha." He paused. "The Omega Quarter specifically. I had intelligence 3 days ago that it was planned. I came to move people out before it could complete." She absorbed this. "The other Omegas," she said, "were moved through the North Gate 2 hours before the fire started. There was enough time for everyone who had been in the dormitory." He held her gaze. "You were not in the dormitory." She had been at the eastern granary wall, which was where she had gone when the strange pull in her belly had woken her before dawn, and she had not been able to lie still. She had been standing in the cold against cold stone, breathing through the beginning of labor, when the horizon had gone orange. "No," she said. "I wasn't." A silence. Then, "The bond found you," he said. "It was not a question either." She looked at him. He was looking back with the same gray certainty, the same weighted stillness. "9 months ago," she said. His jaw moved. Something passed through his eyes that she did not have the vocabulary for yet, but that she recognized in the way you recognize a word in a language you haven't spoken for a long time, not fully, not precisely, but with the bone-deep knowledge that you once knew this and could learn it again. 8 months and 3 weeks ago, he said. For me. The difference of 5 days between their experiences of the same bond. She thought about that. She thought about him, in Ironvale, 8 months and 3 weeks ago, feeling the bond ignite for someone he did not know, someone he could not locate, in a territory where an Ironvale king could not simply walk in and start asking questions about Omegas without triggering a political incident that would dwarf any personal situation. She thought about him carrying that for the same months she had carried it quietly, alone, without a name to put to it. Having the intelligence about the Ashvale fire and knowing, possibly, that his unknown bonded was somewhere inside those walls. Going toward the fire, the bond was no longer a pull. It was a fact, the way the 9 lives were a fact, the way the cold Ironvale air was a fact. It had mass and presence, and it occupied the space between them with the unhurried certainty of something that had been coming for a very long time and had simply arrived. I didn't know who you were, she said. I couldn't have known who you were. She stopped, not out of shame, but because the old vocabulary was inadequate, and she was not sure yet what the new one was. In Ashvale, I was nothing, literally designated nothing. No standing, no mark, no registered bond. The Pups had no father on record, because there is no father on record the bond produced them. The way the old texts say fated bonds sometimes produce life before they're completed, before the wolves even meet, when the connection is strong enough. She looked at him directly. I don't know if you knew that was possible. I know the old texts, he said. Then you know what 9 pups from a fated bond means. She held his gaze. The texts call it a line completion. It means the bond is old, multi-generational. It means whoever carries the completed line carries a claim on both territories, he said quietly, finishing the sentence she had been constructing, and whoever their parent bonded to holds a joint claim. He paused. I know what it means. She breathed. Outside the shelter, the Ironvale forest was beginning to lighten at the edges with the very first gray of morning, and she could hear, distantly, the organized sounds of Ironvale wolves doing what Ironvale wolves apparently did at this hour, moving with purpose, reporting to each other in the efficient shorthand of a pack that ran its border operations with military precision. Around her, 9 pups were beginning the preliminary sounds of hunger, the tentative, escalating declarations that would require her full attention very soon. She had crossed the border into Ironvale with nothing. She was sitting in a border patrol shelter with 9 lives who were, in the language of the old texts, the completion of a fated bond line that predated both of them. She was looking at a king who had walked into a fire to find someone whose name he had not known. You're going to need to explain some things to your pack, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. They've been receiving explanations since I left. And you? She was looking at him very carefully, because this was the question that everything else hinged on, and she had spent 26 years with no standing, and no claim, and no security, and she was not going to pretend that the bond being real, being recognized, solved every practical question that would arise from this night. What does this mean for you? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the 9 pups, small and dark-haired and impossible and absolutely, unambiguously present. He looked at her again. You and I are going to have a great many conversations, he said. About what you want. About what you're willing to allow. About what the old bond demands and what we choose to make of that. He paused. I won't tell you what the bond means for me without knowing what you need it to mean for you. That is not how I intend to operate here. She had not expected that. She had known he was not calculating her worth the way Ashvale had felt the difference in him from the first moment, but she had expected she had been prepared for the bond to become in his hands. What bonds always became in the hands of powerful men in powerful packs, a fact that was used to arrive at a conclusion that had already been decided. She was the Omega, he was the king. The conclusion would be whatever the king had already determined it should be. He was not doing that. She thought about what she wanted to say, and she took her time thinking about it, because he was not rushing her, was simply watching her with that gray, weighted attention, and because the 9 lives around her deserved a mother who did not speak carelessly at moments like this. "I want to stay in Ironvale," she said. "I want them to be registered, named, with standing." She paused. "I want them to have a father's name on the record. If their father," she stopped. Started again. "If you're willing." "I'm willing," he said without hesitating. "And I want to make every other decision slowly," she continued. "I want to know Ironvale before I decide what I am in it. I want to know you before I decide what we are." She held his gaze. "The bond is real. I've known it was real for 9 months, but real isn't the same as decided." He looked at her for a long moment with that expression. She was beginning to translate the arrested stillness, the quality of someone who has moved very fast and been stopped not by obstacle but by arrival. As though she had said something he had been waiting without knowing he was waiting. "No," he agreed, "it isn't. And then, it can be decided in time." The morning light was coming faster now. Senna had moved to the edge of the shelter to give them a version of privacy, the kind that is acknowledged but not dramatic. And the 9 small lives around Mira were increasingly emphatic about their requirements. She looked down at them, dark-haired and fierce and entirely, magnificently here, and felt the thing she had been too afraid to feel for 9 months unfold in her chest like a territory she had not known she owned. Wide and cold and real, like Ironvale air. She looked up at him one more time. He was still there. He would still be there, she understood, when she looked up again. That was not a thing she had been given before, and she received it with both hands, carefully, with the seriousness it deserved. The bond between them held its new weight, not pulling now, not singing, not announcing itself, simply present, settled, the way mountains are settled. The way things are settled when they have arrived where they were always going. She had carried 9 lives through fire. She had not known, when she ran, that she was running toward something, rather than away from everything. She had not known that the thing the bond had been pulling her toward for 9 months was not a place, but a person, and that the person would come toward the fire too, would walk into the burning quarter of someone else's pack, because the bond had been working on him the same way it had been working on her, for 8 months and 3 weeks, quietly and without permission. She had been the lowest in every room she had ever occupied. She had been designated nothing in the pack that had housed her without seeing her. The old texts had a different word for what she was. They had several, actually, but the one that kept surfacing in her memory as the Ironvale morning opened up around the shelter was the simplest one: origin. The one who carries the line? The one whose children rewrite the borders, because borders were drawn by history, and history begins somewhere, and sometimes it begins in a border patrol shelter on cold ground with 9 impossible, magnificent, loudly hungry lives declaring themselves to the morning. Calder reached out and his hand closed over hers, where it rested at the edge of the platform, not possessively, not with the weight of claim. Simply warm, simply there. She turned her hand over and held on. Outside, the last of the night pulled back from the Ironvale tree line, and the morning came, cold and clear and enormous, and Mira, who had never had a name worth recording, who had carried 9 lives and crossed a burning border, and arrived in a place that had no reason to want her, except the oldest and most irrefutable reason of all, breathed the Ironvale air and felt, for the first time in her 26 years, that she had come home.